That's Clint Eastwood's new film, Richard. All right, your 38th film that you've directed.
Clint Eastwood received an unexpected email on a clear morning in Carmel by the Sea that said, "You are invited to discuss the separation of American values on the Ellen DeGeneres Show." It initially appeared to be just another media request, but something about the way the word division was used caused him to hesitate. A former Marine with a dry sense of humor, Jake's longtime assistant, looked up from his laptop. "Ellen, huh?" He gave a small smile in front of the camera, but she was able to poke fun at him. A tarnished silver sheriff's badge that his father had once given him served as a reminder that justice wasn't a catchphrase but rather a duty. Clint leaned back in his worn leather chair and let the sunlight spill across the room that was filled with old scripts, books on American history, and a battered coffee mug. He said softly, "If they want to mock what's right, let's remind them it's not up for debate." Social media was ablaze by the time his plane landed in Burbank, California. Backstage at Warner Brothers Studios in Burbank, the air buzzed under the bright fluorescence as a young stylist approached Clint holding up a pair of sleek modern jackets. "Mr. Eastwood, would you like to update your look a little for the camera?" The young stylist asked Clint, who was sitting by the window with his hands resting quietly in his lap and was not scrolling, practicing, or worried. Clint vs. Ellen was a cultural clash for the ages, pitting old-school values against woke Hollywood. Clint smiled politely, almost imperceptibly, and replied, "I didn't come here to blend in," pulling his worn leather jacket tighter over his shoulders. In the meantime, Ellen DeGeneres shuffled her stack of cards across the stage, giving her producer a stern look that said, "Let's keep it lively," whispering nothing wrong with a little tension to boost the ratings. He adjusted the sheriff's badge pin just inside the lapel, not for the camera or for show, but for himself as a quiet armor against what he knew was coming. The stage crew scurried around, turning on the lights to their brightest, adjusting the mics, and tightening every camera angle to catch every moment of agony the signal was given. The producer nodded, too accustomed to the game to flinch, and they both understood that tension sells better than kindness. As the curtain rose, applause broke out, though it was unequal, with some clapping erratically and others more slowly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ellen said, "please welcome," in a cheerful, polished voice, Eastwood. Clint entered the spotlight with the same calm, unhurried gait he used in every Western he had ever filmed. There was no need for pretense, and as he sat down across from Ellen, he caught a glimpse of her well-known, practiced smile, but the eyes were measuring and calculating. Ellen opened with a few innocuous compliments before leaning forward and speaking in a slightly mockingly warm tone. "You're a legend, Clint," she said, her tone dripping with casual charm. "But don't you ever feel like you're a little out of step with where America's headed these days?" When laughter first started to test the waters, Clint didn't flinch. Instead, he cocked his head slightly, his eyes glinting with calm enjoyment. "America doesn't move in one direction," he calmly stated. "It moves where the people with backbone lead it." Clint hadn't even raised his voice when the first shot was fired, but Ellen's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "You're known for being tough, old-school, unapologetically traditional. Don't you ever wonder if maybe, just maybe, you're clinging to a past America has outgrown?" she said sweetly, tapping her cards with a manicured finger, as the first few minutes on stage played like a practice waltz. "You're known for being tough, old-school, unapologetically traditional. Don't you ever wonder if maybe, just maybe, you're clinging to a past America has outgrown?" The audience clapped, some too eagerly, others more restrained, but beneath the polite banter, the stage creaked with invisible tension. Sensing the initial jab, the audience laughed. Clint didn't blink. Instead, he allowed the stillness to grow longer enough for the laughter to wane and the tension to increase before speaking steadily and slowly. Some things, he continued in a voice as low as distant thunder, are meant to be upheld, not outgrown. But come on, Clint, she said, pressing her voice into mock disbelief. You seriously believe that America, the modern America, still needs cowboys and sheriffs? Isn't that just mythology at this point? Ellen took a sharp breath and shifted slightly in her chair, hiding her discomfort with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She went for round two quicker now, sensing she needed to regain the upper hand. When the law becomes a joke, Clint responds with the same coolness, saying, sometimes the only thing standing between chaos and order is a man who still believes it matters. There were a few more forced than natural laughs scattered throughout the room, and he leaned forward slightly with calm hands on his knees. The old sheriff's badge glinted in the light for a brief heartbeat. Even Ellen hesitated before moving on to her next cue card, forcing a laugh and waving to the audience as though dismissing the gravity of the situation. This time, the quiet wasn't courteous. Rather, it was heavy and unquestionably weighted. With a playful smile, she remarked, "You're passionate, Clint, but passion without progress is just stubbornness, isn't it?" Clint let her finish before lowering his voice a bit, but in some way it filled the entire room as he said, "Don't mean abandoning your soul." There was no music or applause. Just the kind of silence that caused people to shift in their seats as they realized they were no longer watching a scripted show but rather two visions of America colliding, and Clint wasn't playing defense. Instead, he drew a line in the sand and subtly challenged anyone to cross it. Ellen tapped her cue cards once more, a nervous tic she couldn't quite conceal this time, and leaned in harder. "Okay, Clint," she said in a slightly sharper voice. "If you're so committed to the past, where's your compassion, where's your progress? Standing your ground is easy when you refuse to see the world change." The temperature inside the studio was no longer just physical. It was emotional now, thick and heavy and electric. Every word Clint delivered seemed to rearrange the air itself. There were a few faint applause from the audience, but they weren't sure that the energy wasn't flowing as Ellen had anticipated. Clint sat motionless, with no twitches, shifts, or changes in breathing, just a slow lift of his gaze locking onto Ellen's eyes and a silence that seemed louder than applause. He leaned forward just enough that only the front rows saw a slight movement, like a lion casually shifting its weight before the pounce, saying, "Is just another kind of lie." In the control room, a producer whispered, "He's flipping the room." And the words rang out through the studio like dry lightning. "Why does he sound more honest than anyone else we've had on?" A young lighting technician backstage, who was most likely no older than 25, said to his boss. As if recalling something he had long buried, the supervisor didn't respond. Instead, he nodded slowly and almost reluctantly. Near the side stage, a cameraman moved his shoulder rig slightly, lowering the lens so that he could focus more intently on Clint, another crew member at the soundboard who was hidden in the shadows. Clint let out a slow exhale and muttered under his breath, "Finally someone not playing for laughs." "Look," Ellen said a bit too brightly. "Nobody's perfect, even legends can get stuck sometimes, right? Maybe it's time to let the next generation lead." She tried to come back on stage and laugh lightly, but the voice didn't carry and died halfway across the studio floor. This time, there were a few shouts, more out of duty than conviction. Clint waited for the commotion to subside before speaking quietly. "Roots are necessary for the next generation," he stated. Ellen reshuffled her cards more quickly, attempting to locate the next point angle and chuckle, but the tide had turned someplace off stage. A stagehand. It wasn't just wings. A faint murmur went through the audience. In the far corner of the audience, a middle-aged man wearing a polo shirt and a veteran's cap sat slightly straighter, his arms crossed, and he nodded. Beside him, a college-age woman with purple tattoos and askew, muttering loudly enough for two other people to hear, He's not wrong, you know. On the catwalk above, a lighting operator leaned forward on the rail, frowning slightly, not at Clint, but at what was happening directly in front of her, as she looked sideways with a dubious scowl, her face softening somewhat. The conflict was now between Clint and a story rather than just Clint and Ellen, and the narrative was losing ground for the first time in a long time. The studio's temperature was no longer just physical. It was emotional, thick, and electric. Ellen tapped her cards once more, and her voice was a little sharper. "Okay, Clint," she said. "If you're so committed to the past, where's your compassion, where's your progress? Standing your ground is easy when you refuse to see the world change." A few light claps came from the audience, hesitant, unsure that the energy wasn't flowing the way Ellen expected. Clint sat perfectly still, no twitch, no shift, no change in breathing, just the slow lift of his gaze locking onto Ellen's eyes with a quiet that somehow felt louder than applause. He leaned forward just enough that only the front rows noticed a subtle movement, like a lion casually shifting its weight before the pounce. "Compassion without truth," he said evenly, "is just another kind of lie." As if by dry lightning, a producer whispered in the control room, "He's flipping the room. Why does he sound more honest than anyone else we've had on?" A young lighting technician backstage, who was most likely no older than 25, said to his boss. The supervisor didn't respond. Instead, he nodded slowly and seemingly grudgingly, as though recalling something he had long since forgotten on stage. Ellen attempted to pick herself up by laughing lightly, but the sound didn't last. She continued, "Look, a bit too brightly. Nobody's perfect, even legends can get stuck sometimes." But it faded halfway across the studio floor. Perhaps the next generation should take the lead. This time, the cheers came more out of duty than conviction. Clint let the noise subside before speaking without raising his voice. "The next generation needs roots," he stated. "Not just wings." The audience erupted in a hushed whisper. "Not loud, not orchestrated, real." Ellen quickly reshuffled her cards in an attempt to find the next point angle and laugh, but the tide had changed somewhere off stage. A middle-aged man wearing a polo shirt and a veteran's cap sat a little straighter, nodding next to him, with his arms crossed, and a college-age woman with purple hair tattoos. The stagehand was in his mid-30s, with his sleeves rolled up and his headset askew, muttering just loudly enough for two others to hear him. "He's not wrong, you know." When Clint Eastwood picked up the sheriff's badge and revealed his quiet truth, the battle was no longer just Clint versus Ellen, but rather Clint versus a narrative, and for the first time in a long time, the narrative was losing its hold. Her expression softened slightly as she cast a skeptical glance sideways. In the control room, there was a ripple of something far more dangerous than outraged recognition. The studio wasn't just silent, it was stunned into awakening. The cameras cut to a commercial, but nobody backstage was laughing. There was also no mad dash to prepare the next segment, or light-hearted banter among the crew. When Ellen's staff was able to trigger the lively music and flash the stage lights after a senior producer barked into his headset, it was too late. The harm had already extended over the backstage studio walls. "Now, he's turning the story." Clint remained silent in the guest chair, avoiding the flurry of terrified assistants, and without looking at his phone. Jake's internet arguments have left some people furious and others subtly impressed. A young Marine added, "Clint reminded me why I swore an oath," amid a deluge of personal tales. "We need more calm courage like this in our world, not less," a Nebraska nurse wrote. The response was not only political, it was also cultural.